Hey everyone, Katelyn here. Abdul and I recorded the show on Tuesday, and you're going to hear that conversation in a moment. But there was a lot of news that broke out yesterday but after we recorded, so I just wanted to pop in here and tell you what happened. As scheduled, RFK Jr. appeared before two committees, the House Appropriations Committee as well as Senate's Health Committee, to answer questions about how he has been handling Health and Human Services, as well as the proposed cuts that are coming down the pipeline around Medicaid, SNAP, CDC, and all of that. This is the first time Kennedy has been confronted directly by Congress since he was officially appointed, and it's really been the first time he's been forced to defend his actions. And so I watched in incredible anticipation. So here's a quick recap of what happened. In both the House and the Senate, this is the way it works. Each member of the committee gets about 5 minutes to ask Kennedy questions, and here's his answers. When time expires, it moves on to the next person. So this is really rapid fire. These congressmen try to pack a lot in these 5 minutes as much as they can. Kennedy opened up the stage first. He's a lawyer, so he's very good at making talking points and winning an argument, I'll be frank. He opened about making food safer, healthy life choices, chronic disease. He even mentioned social determinants of health that I was really excited to hear. He called about the need for compassion and the need to figure out this mess with healthcare spending. And all of these sound great, right? They're smart. There's something I can get behind. It's politically hard to oppose those. The problem is that these words directly contradict the HHS actions that we've been seeing over the past few months. And so I really don't want to lose that nuance. But in general, after he opened up, it was a pretty tense vibe throughout. Basically, RFK is in a lot of trouble, right? The executive branch, or DOJ, is just abolishing huge swaths of programs. And now RFK has to be accountable for this impact. And it's having a real world impact on Americans on the ground. People are starting to see it and feel these cuts. And this was apparent at every angle during this health committee. Democrats showed up loudly, as they should. They talked about his entire approach to science being concerning the massive cuts to HHS and NIH and how all their constituents were being impacted. Bernie Sanders was actually quite excited and I think surprised, just like a lot of us, by the push for pharma drug prices, and really was interested in pushing Kennedy into a bipartisan approach. The Democrats also hit Kennedy with his vaccine skepticism. Here's a moment where Congresswoman Maggie Hassan asked him why he hired a vaccine skeptic, David Gayer.
What is his job? What is his job at HHS? This is somebody who gave parents the impression that he was a doctor and gave hormone blockers to children as young as 8, telling them that hormone blockers would somehow magically help their kids with autism.
His father
His father is a doctor, but he is not. And his father was not in the room and did not, and he faked his father's signature according to the State Board of Medicine.
And that ruling was overturned by a court. So what you're saying is just wrong.
Now, moving to Republicans, they said things like, quote unquote, "You've cut wasteful spending." They also avoided discussion around science and vaccines, but they also brought up cuts, and I think really good points. Senator Cassidy, for example, talked about long COVID studies being cut, the impact of these cuts that he's going to have on his residents, as well as the impact of removing block grants to hospitals that are really going to impact rural communities' access to health. Cassidy is the chair of the committee, and he opened the meeting with a statement that was both congenial but also laced with some concern. Take a listen.
Mr. Secretary, once more, no one can set the record straight better than you to explain how the department will maintain its critical duties and implement change important to Americans' health. By providing this clarity, we in Congress will be able to advocate for shared priorities in future legislation, and you will gain the trust of the American people, putting their minds at ease.
So you can hear in his voice that he's basically indirectly saying that people don't trust you and trying to be as pointed as possible without getting in trouble with Trump, I guess. I think this is very much true. RFK Jr. has a lot of questions he needs to answer. One of the biggest and I would say most frustrating claim that came out of this committee was that life-saving research and services were just not impacted by the cuts. And this is just not true. There's lots and lots of funding that has been stopped in its tracks, and it's completely irresponsible and even perhaps illegal to not divvy up that money because it has already been appropriated by Congress. One congresswoman mentioned how her friend has stage 4 cancer, was in a clinical trial that was stopped, and is demanding, rightfully so, questions from Kennedy as her friend may die. They don't have time to figure out how best to make this NIH efficient. Time is lives right now. He didn't have really a good answer other than to follow up with his office. So overall reactions to this hearing, it was tense, as honestly it should be. We are talking about life and death here with some of these cuts. Will anything actually come out of this? I don't think so. Congress hasn't been really able to find a spine yet, but I'm glad that they brought him up, got to ask some really hard questions, put his feet to the fire, and now we'll see what RFK Jr. does with this fractured, hurt, and sometimes even morally injured Health and Human Services Department he now oversees. Okay, that's the latest news. Now, enjoy the rest of the show.
Donald Trump tries to fake you out with a move on prescription drug prices, but the Medicaid cuts, very real. This is America Dissected. I'm your host, Dr. Abdul Al-Sayed.
And I'm your co-host, Dr. Katelyn and Abdul.
And we're recording this on Tuesday, May 13th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time as they try to gut Medicaid. So let's start right there. Republican budget proposal that is about as bad as we all thought it was. Now, I just want to be clear about what this proposal is trying to do. They are trying to pass tax cuts that would benefit the very richest in our society and balance the books on the backs of the lowest income people by taking away their health care on Medicaid. Now, I want to talk a little bit about specifically what they're proposing here, all the different fig leaves that they're talking about. They want to impose work requirements for poor, childless adults. So Medicaid recipients would have to prove they're working 80 hours every month to keep their health care, as if somehow this makes sense because, well, imposing more bureaucratic overhead on a bureaucratic program always makes it more efficient, doesn't it? They want to allow states to confirm a Medicaid recipient's income and residency more often. So you got to check in more often with the state and allow them to terminate coverage for people who don't respond promptly. And they want to raise copays for people who earn more than the federal poverty line. And it also calls for denying Medicaid funding for providers that offer abortion services. All told, the Congressional Budget Office, whose responsibility it is to call balls and strikes on this, estimates that 9 million people would lose their Medicaid coverage if it passes. That's more than 10% of all Medicaid recipients. And that's just the top line. There are 1,000 other cuts by which they're trying to kill Medicaid. But Katelyn, what was your reaction when you saw this budget proposal?
Yeah, I mean, the Commerce and Energy Committee, Republicans, they've backed themselves into a corner, honestly, right? They have to cut Medicaid if they want to make this budget go through. And at the same time, 80% of Americans like Medicaid now. I would say that Medicaid is with Medicare and Social Security, that it's the third rail, right? Don't touch it lest you get burned. People really love their Medicaid. And for good reasons. So I guess when I saw this, I was like, okay, this is, I think, a pretty moderate approach for Republicans, which shouldn't be surprised because they have to balance these things that they set themselves up for. It did cut some really controversial proposals like capping federal spending in states that have expanded Medicaid, but then they also packed it in with some pretty intense measures like banning federal funding to Planned Parenthood, which provides a number of preventative resources and empowers a lot of Americans to make healthy decisions for themselves. It also proposed not to fund states that support undocumented immigrants. So I think it scratches that itch for some Republicans. But like you said, I mean, even if this is a moderate approach, it's going to have an impact. There's no way around that. And 10%, I think it was 8.6 million people going insured if this becomes a law, is going to hurt, especially in places where Medicaid is sometimes the only source of support for healthcare, like rural communities, like the South, and like a lot of other low-income areas. So I don't know. I guess I'm not surprised. It could have been worse. It can always be better, but this is also the reality the Republicans are in right now. What do you think, Abdul?
Yeah, it's the reality that they have tied themselves to. Because I want folks to understand the game here. There is a tax cut that Trump passed the first time he was in office that's about to sunset. And so taxes are about to go up on people. Now, of course, if you're Donald Trump and you are holding on to the traditional Republican talking points by like a hair now, your point is that you cannot allow taxes to go up on people. But which people are you talking about? Well, more the people that you like to invite to your golf club, Mar-a-Lago. And so in order to sustain these tax cuts, they now have to find a set of cuts. Now, there are other places you could cut, like, maybe we shouldn't allow our defense budget to continue to bloat in the way that it does. But they've decided to go after Medicaid because, of course, the entire governing philosophy is if we cut taxes at the very top and then stop paying for things for poor people, then we have a, more prosperous society. Like that's the entire argument here. But in order to understand this, like you've got to understand what they tried to do last time Donald Trump got elected, which was to go after the ACA. And one of the most important features of the ACA was that it expanded Medicaid. This is an opportunity to try and have their cake and eat it too, to extend the Trump era tax cut and to go after one of the most important parts of the ACA, which is Medicaid expansion. The consequence is that you're going to have literally millions of people, like my state alone, 500,000 people who are going to get kicked off their health insurance. And just remember, we talk about this as a program for low-income people, but 1 in every 2 kids, like every other kid in Michigan, gets their health care through Medicaid. So you're talking about a very, very sizable proportion of the population. But the other reverberation here that I want people to understand is that Medicaid is a critical part of the reimbursements for some of the poorest hospitals across the country. You're talking about rural hospitals, you're talking about urban hospitals. A lot of these hospitals are going to get shut down if they're not able to rely on the expansion of Medicaid, which was a lifeline for the hospitals. And then when you think about the fact that hospitals after public schools are one of the most important employers in a lot of rural communities, you're talking about people who are going to lose their jobs. Now you're talking about hospitals shutting down, people losing their jobs, and then people having to drive hours and hours after having a heart attack or a stroke to get healthcare. So literally people will die. I mean, this is what this is going to mean. We know that Medicaid expansion saved lives. So if you undo Medicaid expansion, even if it's an ass backwards way like they're trying to do here, people will die. Like that's what this means. So Republicans want us to have a conversation about balancing the budget. But what we really have to ask is, all right, do we want to allow billionaires to get extensions of a tax cut and allow rural Americans to die because of it? Like that is the trade-off that we need to understand here. And the consequences are going to be dire for like whole communities. And that's why, I mean, it is not a partisan issue. Like Josh Hawley, with whom I'm rather certain he probably disagrees with 90% of what we say on this podcast. Josh Hawley, Republican senator out of Missouri, called this immoral, right? Because that's exactly what it is. And so I just want us to understand what the trade-off here is. It's not just cutting a quote unquote entitlement program. This is about cutting a major lifeline for people that protects their healthcare every day.
I'm curious how many people Josh Hawley has in his district that rely on Medicaid.
A lot, right? I mean, you're talking about rural Missouri. I imagine many, many hospitals in Missouri rely disproportionately on Medicaid services.
I agree. You know, someone that is very against or very much wants Medicaid cuts is Chip Roy. He's a Republican in Texas. And he was on, I don't know, PBS NewsHour or something. And so I was curious. I was like, how many people in his district are on Medicaid? And it was only 9%. And so I think if you start also looking at the landscape in which these people are supposed to represent their people, I mean, it starts making it very clear on which side people are on and obviously why.
And Katelyn, you're making a really good point about, you know, we talk about social determinants. And again, I have to use my usual asterisk here. I hate that term because it's used to mean whatever anybody wants it to mean. But let me explain what I'm talking about here. Traditionally, right, because of segregation in our society, the very people who are going to benefit most from the tax cuts live in communities where there are least likely to be people who benefit from Medicaid. And so what this does is it basically pits suburban communities against urban communities and rural communities, right? And, so one of the ways to understand this is of like, if you're Chip Roy, who I bet represents, I don't even know, but I bet represents a suburban community somewhere in one of the large metroplexes.
Outside of Austin.
There you go. For him, he's on the side of the tax cuts, right? And willing to sacrifice healthcare for poor folks who live just outside his district either way, whether you're going into urban Austin or you're going out into the rural hinterlands. And so this is the way that we get pit against each other. And people literally will suffer for it. But listen, there are people who are willing to stand up against this. This is AOC speaking on her Instagram this week.
We're going to drag this thing out, okay? We're going to make this, we are going to grind this thing to a halt. I will be introducing amendments. The chairman will be introducing amendments. Every single member of the committee will be introducing amendments to this bill. We are not going to let them do this in any kind of easy way.
Let me just explain some of the logic here. When someone proposes amendments, it's like somebody being like, all right, friends, we're having pizza. You're like, but what about pepperoni? But what about chicken? What about pepperoni and chicken? What about green onions? What about peppers? And it's a way to actually drag out the legislative process to make sure that they can't get away with doing this without having to work through all of those amendments. So look, one of the big frustrations, of course, is that Donald Trump, who's wanted to do this for a very long time, has a trifecta in Congress. But this is a legislator saying, hey, I'm going to do everything I can with the procedural aspect of my job to try and drag this out, to slow it down, so that maybe people see the light at the end of the tunnel. And look, this can be a bipartisan effort. And I do hope that more people on Trump's side of the aisle are willing to see this for what it is, just like Josh Hawley has been articulating here.
I think AOC dragging this out is really a brilliant political move. I mean, I know she's brilliant politically anyways, but because I don't think people realize how little time Republicans have to also bring this to the House. Typically, the executive budget is introduced in February. It was just introduced last week. That means Republicans have about 4 weeks to get this thing through. And I think AOC knows that and obviously knows it better than I do and is smart. But look, I think I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, Abdul. I think this is going to make it through the House. I don't think it's going to make it through the Senate. And we're going to rely on a continuing resolution. I guess we'll see how this all plays out.
I think you're probably right on that, Katelyn. And look, I just want to remind folks that if you're pissing mad about this, then this is the opportunity to step up. And particularly those of you who are listening, if your member of Congress or if your senator is not on the right side of this, this is the time to let them know what you think. And it's not just, definitely call Congress, definitely write letters, but also, right, join a protest, right? It is not right to try and pass a tax cut on the backs of healthcare for millions of people in our country. And so this is the time to have your voice heard.
Yes. And I would add to that, Abdul, that not only if you disagree with them, but also if you agree with them, just like Josh Hawley, like if you definitely agree that he is doing the right thing and backing up Medicaid for your district, call them and tell them that. Like they need to hear this stuff too, that you're paying attention and to really wanting them to do their job, which is represent you. We wrote on Wiley, my newsletter last week, some tips to do this. If anyone wants some help figuring out how best to reach and effectively to reach their members. But a lot of it comes down to your story, bringing it to the local perspective and really building a relationship with your representatives. So, Abdul, next thing, this is a big week in health policy. Let's pivot to prescription drugs. President Trump signed an executive order on Monday asking drug makers to voluntarily reset their U.S. prices to match what they charge in other countries. What do you think, Abdul? You think it's going to work, that they're just going to listen?
No, if there was a new form of executive order called an executive request, this would be that, right? So Donald Trump really showing his ass on this one. But let's actually break down the policy here on its own terms. We know that in the United States, despite the fact that a lot of our taxpayer dollars subsidize the research and development for prescription drugs, we end up paying more for those prescription drugs than any other country in the world. And that's because in other countries, they do the logical thing, which, by the way, we started to do in a very small way under the Inflation Reduction Act, which is to negotiate with prescription drug manufacturers over those prices. And just so folks understand, right, once a piece of science is developed that may lead to a successful pharmaceutical, that gets rolled out into a biotech company. That company then usually gets bought by a large pharmaceutical. They finish out the clinical research to bring that drug to market. And once they do, they end up spending substantially more on marketing to our market than any other place in the world, in large part because we're one of 2 countries in the world that allow direct-to-consumer marketing for pharmaceuticals, us and New Zealand, weirdly enough. But also, we're one of the only ones up until recently where our public payers, so Medicaid and Medicare, weren't able to negotiate prescription drug prices, despite the fact that the VA can do it, right? So if you're at the VA, you're getting better rates than you can on Medicare. Now, why was that the case? Because when Medicare moved into prescription drugs, the pharmaceutical industry basically struck a deal to allow legislators to vote on it so long as the policy didn't allow Medicare to negotiate the price of prescription drugs. That changed with the Inflation Reduction Act. We have a growing formulary of medications that can be negotiated. But what this basically does is said, well, we're going to ask pharmaceutical companies to not charge us more than they charge other countries. But if, for example, you were to turn this into law, beyond a request, so if this really was an order, which I don't think you could get away with, you'd actually need legislation. You know what the pharmaceutical industry would do? They would just raise their prices abroad. They would work a lot harder to raise their prices abroad so that we would be paying whatever the price was that was now higher everywhere else. So instead of lowering our prescription drugs, the functional outcome of this is probably just going to raise prescription drug prices on everywhere else. So I don't want other people to have to pay more. I want us to have to pay less. And the obvious way to do that is to empower more price negotiation by Medicare. Remember, Medicare pays for a very large proportion of the prescription drugs bought in this country because, of course, Medicare funds healthcare for seniors who tend to take more prescription drugs. So that's the way to do it, which, by the way, we did via legislation under the Biden administration, which, by the way, Donald Trump thinks is stupid, despite the fact that his approach is now to request that we pay less, which makes zero sense. Yeah, he is. Yeah. He really is.
Yeah, and there's other tools, right, that work not just with Medicare price negotiation. I think an interesting one is thinking about faster approvals of generics, which are lower cost versions of these brand name drugs, but companies are very slow to release them through all these loopholes and lawsuits because it ends up lowering prices. There's also these there's these shady agreements where brand name drugs pay a generic competitor not to release their cheaper version. I think outlawing those deals could also open up a market to more affordable. There's so many different ways that this could go. It's hard though, just like you said, that 2003 legislation that passed, that means we can't negotiate. It is continuing to just haunt us. And it's going to take real teeth to decrease these drug prices, which I think a vast majority of us agree with. And I think that's why Trump is using his stage to say he's doing these stuff, get people really excited. But the execution is just to be determined. I just don't know how he's going to get around this.
Greatest showman, worst president. The thing I want folks to remember is when you have a public consensus over here and a political consensus over here, the difference is probably somebody's money. And in this case, pharma is the single biggest lobbyist by sector of any sector of the economy in the country. They spent about $4.4 billion over the past 20 years lobbying congresspeople. So when you spend that kind of money, that's not even including the money that they spend in PAC checks to help get their favorite people elected, right? That's just the money they spend lobbying. So you imagine what that means. It means every member of Congress has 3 or 4 people whose sole job it is to convince them of a thing, right? And usually to remind them, who gave them a PAC check when they got elected in the first place. So all of that is to say that there's a lot of money spent to make sure that our prescription drugs are as expensive as they are. And so it's not surprising to see like this completely toothless approach from the White House so that, you could placate people, making them think that you're actually doing something that you're not really doing. And then there are other approaches that we could use. I mean, you just think about how much basic research and development gets done that's funded by you and I, the taxpayer. Now, in any other investment situation, right? Like if you invested early, then you should have dividends paid on the back end. So you could imagine a situation where, look, if you're licensing NIH-funded research, that the NIH should get paid back, which is the U.S. taxpayer gets paid back, right? And you can start billing that against the cost that we end up paying through Medicaid, Medicare, and other programs. And so there are a lot of ways, if we were serious about taking this on, that we could. The fundamental issue, right, is that unfortunately too often Congress has a lot of incentives in the form of $4.4 billion to make sure that we don't act. And unfortunately, when it comes to healthcare policy, the story writes itself over and over and over again. Why don't we have guaranteed healthcare for everybody? Well, the health insurance industry is number 2 when it comes to lobbyists by sector, right? Why don't we have a more robust public healthcare system? Well, because health and hospitals, right, they tend to give a lot of money. They're number 8 on that list. So unfortunately, too often, it's the way that we have this lack of a firewall between our politics and our economics that allows very, very, very big companies to have their way. And nowhere is that on display more than in healthcare.
It's exhausting.
It is. It really is. I mean, and that's the thing, is like, how often we're going to have the same conversation. America Dissected is brought to you by the Dopamine Foundation. For 25 years, the Dopamine Foundation has worked to create practical solutions that improve the health of communities across the country. The foundation advances policy, builds partnerships, and strengthens systems to give everyone the opportunity to achieve their best possible health. To learn more, visit dopamine.org. Let's talk about Casey Means, Katelyn.
Yeah.
What does Casey Means? I don't know. All right. So today on the Maha front, Trump's pick for Surgeon General is Casey Means. Katelyn, tell us what Casey means.
Yeah. Casey Means, physician, ENT, so ears, nose, and throat, trained physician, turned into a social media influencer, more around wellness. She founded this wellness tech company, which basically profits on selling everyday Americans continuous glucose monitoring, which is not useful for the general public. There's only really strong evidence to show that these devices are useful for people and worth the investment for people with diabetes who take insulin. She has a long record of also very controversial, I would say not evidence-backed viewpoints on public health. She's questioned the number of childhood vaccines there are. She's a big advocate for drinking raw milk. And she's suggested unsafe practices, literally like how do you make Ozempic at home. So she's going up for Surgeon General. And ultimately what I wrote in my newsletter, I deeply think that she is a figure of what is happening on a bigger level, this trend in capitalizing on the failures of food and health policy by turning health into this consumer lifestyle brand and really leveraging the wealthy and healthy movement without thinking or talking or strategizing on the systems in which make us all sick, and particularly the most vulnerable sick. I will say, I thought she was going to be a shoo-in, and then this fascinating thing has started to develop over the past few days where like she's made everyone mad. From MAGA, right? Laura Loomer, she's this influencer within the White House, very with Trump's ear, very angry that Means is even being considered. A lot of people actually in the MAHA movement don't like her because she's too supportive of vaccines. About 50% of MAHA movement doesn't want vaccines at all. And then, of course, there's us in public health. We're like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, so, you know, I don't know. I don't know if she'll sail through. It'll be really fascinating to see how this unfolds. You know, on my freak out meter, I would say I'm a, you know, bit low to moderate freak out. The Surgeon General is important, but they don't necessarily like determine policy. They basically have a big megaphone. And so that's where other Surgeon Generals have used their megaphone for good. For example, cigarettes and cancer, loneliness, alcohol. So we'll see what happens. Abdul, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, look, the issue is that it's very clear that this person is unhinged from any real basis in fact or science. And I think the point that you made about how she's kind of pissed everyone off demonstrates a lot of the end game for a lot of these movements that are unmoored to truth, right? Because if there is not a central fealty to the truth or a common source of evidence, what can happen is that, you know, any one group is going to decide what matters to them more, and then these groups will start to factionalize and fight each other. And, you know, you're seeing this within the MAHA and the MAGA and the, you know, movements. And so it's not surprising to me that that they're kind of eating her alive. That's also to say that, you know, this is not the first nominee for the role, right? This is the second nominee. And because it's such a figurehead role, I actually think it's attracted so much more scrutiny than a lot of these more important roles. I mean, I would argue that, you know, the top regulators at the FDA are substantially more important for policy. So just last week we talked about Vinay Prasad. There's way less outrage over his appointment, but for this one, because it is the Surgeon General, you know, a role with a lot of mimetic power, even if not policy power, it's bringing out a lot of the worst angst of this, which also calls into question, like, a lot of these folks just don't understand how government works, right? And I'm not talking about like the public. I'm just talking about the people who actually work in government making these appointments, or trying to influence these appointments. And so, you know, I don't know if she'll get appointed. I'll be honest with you, anybody who's considering appointing a Casey Means, I don't think that they come upon anybody who we would agree with. And this just furthers the problematic consequence of giving platforms to people who are not going to use them to actually spread evidence-based recommendations. So whether it's Casey Means or whoever the replacement is after this, I don't think we're going to get somebody who's going to use this role responsibly. I will say, like, there is something really problematic about this administration and the ways that they've tried to grift. So like, this is somebody who has like a wellness startup, and it's hard to see this person not trying to use it to make a buck on the back end, right? And you know, this is how they're selling out our government. So there's that.
We have good news.
We have good news. We have good news. Good things. We can have nice things, Katelyn. So you wrote about this in Wiley this week. New York State has passed a law adopting a universal free school meal program. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm so excited about this. This is called basically Universal School Meals, which means every kid will get a free breakfast and lunch in the state, regardless of their income status. We actually have this in California, and my daughter receives this, and I think it is incredible. There's a lot of good that comes with this, right? Typically, talking points of people that oppose is that it's expensive and that wealthy families shouldn't get free lunch. But the benefits are huge, right? Not just increasing access to food, obviously, but also reducing lunch stigma. Like, my daughter doesn't know who can and cannot afford lunch because they're all getting the same tofu and spinach at lunch every day. There's actually a lot less administrative burden too. A lot of states, maybe all states, have a low income program that you can apply to get free lunch. This is different, that everyone just gets it. You don't need to apply. You don't need to prove that you can get it. And so I'm really excited that New York has now joined 8 other states, and hopefully this is building momentum, particularly what I have seen gain steam after the pandemic, where we saw a lot of truth very quickly about how much kids rely on meals at schools and what happens when they shut down, like during a pandemic. So excited to see this. Hopefully we'll see more of it.
So I think you're right. And I think there is a broader theme of today's episode, which is that means testing is mean. Now, let me explain what I mean by means testing. The minute you start imposing certain requirements for certain people to get certain services, you put a huge bureaucratic overhead on that program. The other part of it is that you start, by definition, separating people who see themselves as the ones who pay for a program from the people who get receipts from that program. And so once you start doing that, you by definition turn certain people against the program, right? And Katelyn, even if you're somebody who can afford school meals for your kid, it's still a value to you that you don't have to think about packing a lunch, that that your kid gets a lunch, and that they're part of a collective and a normalization of people eating school lunches. And so, the challenge, right, with Medicaid is a lot of the way that Republicans are coming for Medicaid is they're trying to put more means testing on top of the program. And then guess what they do? They then point to the inefficiency of all that means testing bureaucracy, all the work that you do to try and figure out who can and can't get the service, and then point to that and say it's so inefficient, so that the program is so inefficient. But then it's a thing that you put on top of the program to make it less efficient. And so you see that across the board in so much public policy, this being one of them. So I think for a lot of us in public health, we've got to be really smart about advocating for universal programs that benefit everybody, because it reduces the inefficiency of the program, the number of bureaucrats who are involved in just bean counting to figure out who can and can't, and also that it normalizes the receipt of the program. And this is just one example of that. Medicaid, it is a great program made so much worse because of all these requirements that are put upon it. And these are just two peas in a pod when it comes to public health policy.
All right, Abdul, tell us about the interview this week.
I had a really good conversation with former FDA Commissioner David Kessler. He also led Operation Warp Speed, which of course was Trump 1's effort to research, develop, and manufacture a COVID-19 vaccine within less than a year, which they achieved, but then he ran away from for the rest of his political career. And he's written extensively on nutrition. That's actually his broad background. He's just published a new book called Diet, Drugs, and Dopamine. We had a really interesting conversation ranging everywhere from ultra-processed foods to the dopamine axis to GLP-1 drugs. So I hope that folks will stick around. It was a good conversation, and I learned a lot. All right, Katelyn, what do we have on tap this week in San Diego? 70 degrees and sunny?
It is 70 degrees and sunny, guys. It is gorgeous.
I'm going to stop asking that question. At least like here in Michigan, it's like 60 degrees and somewhat sunny, and we have beautiful blooms of flowers, so I can't complain too much. But there's going to come a time where I ask you that question, and it's like the middle of winter, and I'm not going to like the answer. So I should probably just
I will say I am stressing a little because my daughter's birthday party is on Sunday, and it's supposed to rain.
I both feel bad for I feel bad for her, but also like I just can't feel so bad. It's like it's one of the 3 times it rains in San Diego.
Yeah, we'll see if it stands up. But
are you guys? So do you have an indoor option?
Well, not really. It's outdoor at we were going
She's
to
like
a farm.
I live in San Diego.
What is indoor?
Who does things indoors? How do you even live?
We'll figure it out. As
I come to you from my basement. No, I happy birthday to her. I hope that it doesn't rain. I hope that she has an amazing birthday, and I hope that you guys have a really good time running after many small children.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much. We'll see you guys next week.
All right. Thanks, friends. America Dissected is brought to you by Lumen. Your metabolism, it's the central way your body processes your energy. So if it's working well, you feel the benefits in nearly every aspect of your life. I've found a valuable tool that gives me insights to support a healthy metabolism. It's called Lumen. Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. It's a device that measures your metabolism through your breath. And on the app, it lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs and gives you tailored guidance to improve your nutrition, your workouts, sleep, and even stress management. All you've got to do is breathe into your Lumen first thing in the morning, and you'll know what's going on with your metabolism, whether you're burning mostly fats or carbs. From there, Lumen gives you a personalized nutrition plan for that day based on your measurements. You can also breathe into it before and after workouts and meals, so you know exactly what's going on in your body in real time, and Lumen will give you tips to keep you on top of your health game. We just came through the month of Ramadan, where Muslims fast from dawn to sunset. Now, trying to figure out when to work out becomes really difficult when you're fasting. And for me, it was a real challenge. And that's where my Lumen became irreplaceable. It helped me figure out when to maximize my workouts without overtaxing my body. I tried to lift when I was burning carbs and do cardio when I was burning fat. The warmer months, they're coming. Spring back into your health and fitness. Go to lumen.me/AD to get 15% off your Lumen. That's LUMEN.me/AD for 15% off your purchase. Thank you, Lumen, for sponsoring this episode. Okay, let's kick off. Can you introduce yourself for the tape?
My name is David Kessler. I am a pediatrician. I have had the privilege of taking on a number of public health issues over my career.
Well, we really appreciate you joining us because you've been a consistent voice on the topic of our conversation today. In fact, you started one of the first earlier books you wrote about 15 years ago now was called The End of Overeating. And you wrote about hyperpalatability of processed foods and how food manufacturers have sort of cracked the code on putting salt, sugar, and fat together to make foods that much more hyperpalatable and that much more irresistible. You came back to the topic in your most recent book, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to sort of help us bridge your thinking over the past 15 years. How have breakthroughs in science changed the way you think about this issue?
A wonderful question. It actually goes back before that book. Back when I was FDA Commissioner, we did the food label. So that was really the first effort to give consumers information about what they were eating. We even won the National Endowments for the Arts, gave us the Presidential Design Award for the food label. It gave the whole team. And I wondered why give us the Presidential Design Award? It's for great graphic artists, for architects. And the reason they gave us the award was to be able to convey, important information in a very small amount of space, right? But what was the information? I mean, at that time, people, didn't have that information. It was calories, fat, sugar, and salt. I then had the privilege of going inside for the first time the tobacco industry, completely different effort while we were at FDA, and had to learn everything about addiction and what they knew. Left FDA, but there was when I was there learning everything about addiction, one thing that struck me was, how animals will press a lever for a reinforcing substance. It's actually called self-administration. And nicotine, drugs of abuse, it's how DEA, NIH, FDA decides whether to label something a controlled substance. Is it self-administered? And, one of the sort of control arms to those experiments, was sucrose. So they had animals pressing levers for sucrose. And I always said, why are you using sucrose? And I never got a real answer. Right? So I became very interested in, what drives overeating. And at the core of that, is highly palatable foods. Right? And those foods are designed in such a way, industry will say they design it for bliss point, but that optimal pleasure point. And they can achieve it by fat and sugar, fat and salt, fat, sugar, and salt. That work, I think, started, the next decade and a half, spawned a lot of work on how food, especially highly palatable food, affects the reward circuits of the brain. Right? Prior to that, most of us were taught, right? I don't know about you, in physiology, the homeostatic systems, but here we're talking about the hedonic systems, the addictive circuits of the brain, the rewarding circuits of the brain. So that spawned a lot of research. That show that those highly palatable substances can trigger the reinforcing reward addictive circuits of the brain over the last decade and a half. The reason I did this book, we all went through your leadership. I had the opportunity to co-lead Operation Warp Speed. And 676 million vaccines, pretty intense period for all of us. I didn't leave my computer. I worked 18-hour days for 2-3 years. And I found myself, at the end of that, 40 pounds heavier than when I started. Right? And it was simply stress. I mean, I eat to calm myself. If I need energy, if I need to keep on working, from the point where I was a kid, I would reach for food. But I really wanted to, after COVID, go spend the next 2 years studying weight and what was driving weight. And what became very apparent to me, and if you ask what the thesis of the book is really about, what the thesis is, it's not how big we are or small we are. It's this visceral fat, this central metabolically active fat, call it sick fat or toxic fat. It's the fat that accumulates in the abdomen that surrounds and even invades certain layers of the liver, of the pancreas, and of the heart, and is in the causal chain. And this is something I don't think many docs realize. We all knew weight wasn't good for us, right? We always knew it was a risk factor, but we didn't know that it was causal. So if you look at the vast majority of cardiometabolic diseases, if you look at 13 forms of cancer, you look at some forms of dementia, diabetes, certainly. I mean, there's over 200 diseases. Visceral fat, is probably the number one driver of chronic disease in this country. And then the question is, what can you do about it?
One of the things I really love about this book is that it lands in the midst of almost a codification of a set of understandings, right? The first is, that there's now a name for what you sort of put a point to in the end of overeating, which we now call ultra processed foods, right? And we've got a little bit more science to demonstrate some of the pathways by which this is a problem. And then you specifically call out the role of dopamine and the way that our society has built so much of itself and organized us in ways to maximize dopamine, and then the connection to that between those two things and metabolically active fats. I want to stop for a second here on this dopamine forward society piece, because food is not the only sort of dopamine release that we optimize around. You think about the rise of online betting. You think about smartphones and social media. You think about our food systems. Like all of these sort of go back to this way to sell us things at the edge of getting a different kind of dopamine hit. And the irony of this is that you'd think that so much dopamine would quench our thirst for it, but ironically, it doesn't. Can you talk a little bit about this sort of this insatiable dopamine need and the ways that we've sort of built a society around it and the implications that has?
Again, the question is spot on. I think we have to admit that dopamine is really a surrogate for a range of neurochemical compounds and neural pathways, so we don't fully understand. Right? And let's agree on a few things first. I don't think food is the same thing as cocaine or amphetamines. There are certain substances that markedly hijack the dopamine circuits, amphetamine, cocaine. You don't see those rise, that same degree of rise with these highly palatable foods. You see a rise, but not off the charts with amphetamine and cocaine. But neither do you see it with nicotine. Right? And I certainly, in my own experience, find myself, if I just observe when I eat, right, and how I eat through the day, I'm almost grazing. I use food to calm myself. I use food to sort of focus my attention, to stimulate. I mean, very much such that, if I, grew up 30 years earlier, I probably would have been a smoker and used nicotine in the same kind of way throughout the day to change, how I feel. But I think you're the key part of your question. If you look at what dopamine does, I mean, there are three real parts of addiction, and I think we have to realize that addiction's not for the weak. It's not for the downtrodden. I mean, it's really, those addictive circuits are part of all of us, right? But what are those components? I mean, the first component is what's cue-induced wanting. Something captures my attention. It could be out of my conscious, but that cue, whether it's a time of day, whether it's location, it's a smell, it's an internal feeling. That cue-induced wanting, I think, is a major component of these processes. The second component is craving. That cue-induced wanting stimulates a craving, a preoccupation. Look, I can eat anytime, and I can keep on going. I don't have that craving. It's only when you take it away from me, that absence of it, right, that I really experience that craving. And third is relapse, right? The one thing is, once those circuits are laid down, they're laid down for a long period of time. I mean, they are there. And one of the things that always sort of puzzled me, and I think puzzled a lot of the medical community, is that every time anyone loses weight, eventually they gain it back. I mean, that's in part because there's metabolic adaptation, but it's also, there's an increased appetite after you lose that weight. And I think that's because those reward pathways, those addictive pathways, those dopamine pathways are still there. But I think we have to be careful that we just don't say this is just dopamine. But to your point, I could be captured, by a lot of different stimuli. What is it that captures me? It's the most salient stimuli in my environment. I mean, food was sort of the first addiction. I mean, from an evolutionary point of view, it was energy dense. I needed it to survival. I mean, if I'm a bird and I'm flying over, I mean, I have to find that food and know where that prey is to be able to survive. So those circuits evolve for a reason. But for each of us, what that salient stimuli end up being can be different. But my guess is that there's one common denominator, and it's that they change how we feel. So anything that can change how you feel, right? Anything that can make me feel better, right? Anything that can calm me, anything that can distract me, has the ability to become a salient stimuli and capture my attention and those circuits.
Yeah, I mean, and it's important always to remember that, in a world where energy is scarce, you need that circuitry to propel you forward to do the thing of like feeding yourself. We've just created a world where these things are abundant, and not just abundant, but like the least favorable simulacra of these things are abundant, right? So you think about like ultra processed food versus healthy, nutritious food. You think about porn versus sex. Like, these are different kinds of things that hijack, or we'll just say corporate capitalism has manufactured to hijack those that initially laid internal wiring, right, to get us to want and consume more, and to do so in ways that don't necessarily benefit us over the long term. And it's a sort of an interesting thing, right? Because, a lot of times when we've studied the question of weight in the past, we tend to look at inter-individual differences, and we tend to forget intertemporal differences, right? How the world has changed around us in ways that have made a lot of these things more abundant. And then the question of differences between people has a lot more to do with how susceptible you are to an environment, rather than whether or not you are coded for a particular thing. And it's the environment that that really has changed around us. America Dissected is brought to you by Our Big Shot, a new podcast series exploring one of the biggest achievements in human history, the worldwide effort of immunization. Hosted by friend of the pod, Dr. Seema Yasmin, Our Big Shot features accessible stories you don't want to miss. Too often, conversations about vaccines, they feature tragedy, misinformation, and discord. But this podcast tells the story of something completely different. It's a celebration of the 154 million lives saved by the combined efforts of the human race. Dr. Yasmin, disease detective turned journalist, unravels the history of our struggle against disease and what that means for the future and how we continue with the goal of eradicating disease. She has personal experience working worldwide with scientists, psychologists, communities, parents, and children with one mission, to wipe out disease. And she brings her firsthand, clear-eyed experience through conversations from around the globe that both astound and inspire. This series doesn't shy away from examining the many issues around immunization development, both from history and the present day, and uses both to ask questions about what we want for the future of science, social media, and ourselves. I really love Dr. Yasmin's take because she's both a practitioner and also a journalist. She brings that empathy to everything she does, including this incredible podcast series. Search for and subscribe to Our Big Shot, Wiping Out Disease on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. I want to ask you, because part of the point of your book has been to comment on this new class of GLP-1 agonists that specifically work at that central neural level and seem to have impact not just on cravings for food, but cravings generally. Like we're seeing it for smoking, we're seeing it for folks who have opioid abuse disorder. You're seeing it work centrally on a number of different issues. And you're looking at this class and saying, hey, this may actually be the response that may be scalable and allow us to actually address what's happening around us. Can you speak a little bit to GLP-1s, your sense of their role in taking this on?
Yeah, so I think you have to be careful on the mechanism and how they work. I'm not convinced they have a direct effect on the reward circuits. That remains to be worked out. They certainly have an effect on the part of the brain called the area postrema, the NTS, solitarius. Those are the hindbrains. Those are, the part of the brain, that, is associated with GI distress, right? I mean, the area postrema, was called the vomit center of the brain. We were taught. So what's going on with these drugs? I don't think there's a magic to them. Now, I don't want to be overly reductionistic, but, when you're dealing with a drug, what is the mechanism? I think the way these drugs work, and I don't think the companies have fully leveled with everybody, is these drugs work by slowing gastric emptying. So food stays in your stomach longer. So if you get the flu, right, and food is just staying in your stomach and it's not moving through, right, because the GI tract, slows down, how does that make you feel? I mean, it's going to make you nauseous, right? And I think in food poisoning, right, how do you feel? Food ends up, the GI tract shuts down as far as movement, and food stays there. So it builds up and you have this bloating sense. And there's obviously a cascade from satiety to feeling some discomfort to being on the edge of nausea to being outright nauseous or vomiting. And there's that cascade. And I think that phenomena, I think, is both peripherally and centrally mediated. So I think it has an effect on both the GI tract as well as this area of the brain. Now, you have this reward circuit on the one hand, these addictive circuits, very powerful. And what's the one thing that is strong enough to overcome that, right? If you want to shut that down, I think, I think these drugs take people. Now, everyone's different, right? And not everybody has the same reaction. But I think the sort of the real breakthrough of these drugs is they figured out how to titrate people to take people to the edge of nausea. And, some people get over that line. But if I make you nauseous, if you have the flu, what's the one thing about appetite that's consistent across the board? it decreases your appetite. Why? I mean, because I think you can shut down those circuits, right, by stimulating these other pathways. Now, whether these drugs also have a central effect beyond that GI distress, I still think has to be worked out. There's some elegant neuroscience that is happening. But the jury is still out. Are these drugs going to be effective for alcohol? Maybe. There's some preliminary data, but I'm not convinced that, if you stimulate nausea, will that be enough for to overcome alcohol?
What do you make on some of the early findings demonstrating reductions in other types of cravings, right, independent of food? There's been some recent studies looking at cravings for opioids, for example, cravings for cigarettes. That would suggest to me that there would be some central action independent of the mechanistic effect on the gut. But it's that I wanted to ask what your thoughts were.
But even that mechanistic action of the gut is part central, and the reason the GI tract slows down. I mean, when you gave these drugs back a decade ago when they were being developed, some of the key researchers found that animals, they would describe it, had visceral malaise. That was the term. They wouldn't move. Now, some of this was getting the dose, right? So again, I think the work with cigarettes and opioids, if I'm correct, is very preliminary.
Very preliminary.
And we don't have that data. And I think maybe that those general malaise circuits that I'm talking about will also work and cross over. Maybe there's an additional effect on the brain, but I think the jury is out. Can I just go back to two other things?
Please.
You said, one, you're right. I mean, I do talk about highly processed foods, but I use a different term. I use the word ultra formulated because I don't think it's just processing. I think it's the formulation, and there's maybe a subtle distinction because I think it's highly processed, highly palatable, high glycemic index, energy dense foods that are responsible for that visceral adiposity, that are killing, and certainly the morbidity and the mortality. I mean, I think the opportunity is as great as with tobacco. The distinction I make on ultra formulated is that you can make ultra formulated foods in your kitchen. It's not just the emulsifiers. It's just not the preservatives. I mean, it's this trifecta of fat, sugar, and salt, right? That perfect trifecta, and it's in that formulation. The other thing that I think you touched on, you used this word abundance, which I think is right on. The book opens, and I went to Sardinia because if you look, at least allegedly, I'm not sure the data really is there, but allegedly, people were claiming people live longer in Sardinia, certainly in the mountain regions, the shepherds, the blue zones. I'm not sure whether that really pans out. I have my doubts on those numbers. But what we do know is that a diet of scarcity, regrettably, it was a diet almost of poverty, right? If you look at that diet compared to when in Sardinia, it came relatively late compared to the States, right? Where abundance, that economic development, and what that wrought, and that really wrought this metabolic chaos to our bodies. I mean, but it is, and you see it. I mean, in those environments that shifted to abundance, and especially that shifted to a so-called Western diet.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that point. It's interesting because it is impossible for me not to think through this challenge and think through it as not just, energy abundance by happenstance, but energy abundance by manufacturing, specifically with the goal of selling you abundant energy that that gets at this. And what happens is you end up getting this fetishization of other diets, the Mediterranean diet, as you mentioned, et cetera. And then what happens is we take these other diets, huge corporations that manufactured the other foods that we're all trying to avoid, figure out how to game that system and then sell you these things with the argument that somehow another food product is going to buy you out of this challenge. And, you think through like the central technology that has driven this, it is that ability to sort of optimize and very quickly, like you said, formulate around a set of goals, always with the goal of trying to sell you something else, right? And that's I've always sort of recoiled from that like diet-based approach. If only you ate like this, then you'd solve the problem.
But look, there's something inherently wrong with this picture. I mean, you have one industry that makes billions of dollars that makes us sick and you have another industry making billions of dollars, right, to treat what that former industry does.
Well put.
Right?
Very well put.
If you came from a different planet and you saw this going on, you would say, "What is going on?" But that's the situation that we're in. That's the hand that we're dealt, and it's called. I mean, if you look at just the degree of suffering that people endure because of this, especially in their later years, because this adiposity is cumulative. I mean, they lose muscle, but the fat continues to accumulate. Maybe it doesn't shorten lifespan that much, although we are the least, of the most developed nations. We're 4 years, shorter in lifespan. But the one thing that I am sure, the amount of disability that this causes in the more senior years is absolutely profound.
Yeah. No, I always, when I teach, I always used to start with the idea of what our ancestors would have made of being transported into a modern gym with rows and rows of treadmills where people are just running in place. And the idea that you would expend that much energy to get nowhere at all would have blown minds. But, that's a circumstance. You're right. Like we've created a whole set of industries around excess because of this one other industry that makes billions of dollars selling us, right, the addicts to disease.
And the other thing that I think is very real here is how ill-equipped our healthcare system is to deal and to provide. I mean, look, these drugs are far from the panacea. They are not the magic pill, right? I don't think there should be any stigma about using it. I mean, the one thing that we know is these drugs are highly effective. Yes, they're potentially dangerous. I mean, unless used in good hands, they have to be used at the right doses, good medical care, make sure there's not malnutrition, shouldn't be handed out, without making sure, there's also nutrition therapy, behavior therapy. They have to be part of chronic, I mean, we're really taking care of a chronic condition, but, we're just, we don't know how to use these drugs wisely.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, in the long term.
I wanted to ask you on exactly this because, it would be impossible as a former FDA director for me not to ask you this, but we're seeing a discourse about this, right? Those of us in public health would say that really the best approach here is to address the front end, right? Address the ways that our public policy tends to drive or at least empower these corporations that manufacture this ultra-formulated food. And on the other, these are extremely effective, seem to be pretty safe medications. And now there's a question of should they or should they not be publicly accessible and funded? And I'd love to get your sense on how we should be thinking about that. Should Medicaid, Medicare cover these? And how should we be thinking about that? And are we even thinking about it the right way?
Absolutely. There's no question in my mind. I think the Biden administration was right to propose coverage of these. I think it's discriminatory against the class, the class of people, the people who are living with either prediabetes or overweight or obesity. And I think that violates the ACA, to to be honest,
Yeah.
the anti-discrimination standards of that act. I think it's a mistake for the current administration to have rescinded that proposal.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I guess my question is, it's very difficult, obviously. We spent a lot of time on this podcast trying to retrospectively ascribe logic to what RFK and his team do. But what do you think is driving that discourse there by which they get to that answer?
I don't know what drove that decision. I don't know who made that decision. Look, I think that there's a bias here that we have to be careful about. There should be no stigma attached to using a pharmacological agent as long as it's used well, recognizing it's not the panacea, but let's not deny people therapies. But the one thing the drug shows is this is not a question of willpower, right? Because these drugs work, right? They are highly effective and they work on biological circuits. We can decide whether it's the area of postrema or whether it's further upstream in the reward circuits. We'll learn more about this. But these drugs work, and they work on the biology, and the biology is what's driving that eating, and is the reason why you can't maintain it. It's not a question of willpower. And I think there's a bias still among some. Just go eat well, just go exercise, go to the gym for 3 hours a day, and you don't need these drugs. So I think there's a bias, right? Again, I am a strong believer in nutrition therapy. I think the most important part of I think dietitians, more than docs, more than anyone else, deserve our admiration and thanks, right? The great thing about these drugs is they allow you to learn to eat differently. Because when you're nauseous or you're on that edge of nausea, you don't want to put food in your stomach to make you worse. And that conditions. I know it sounds pretty reductionistic, but I think it's as simple as you get to recondition yourself.
I agree with you. These are extremely powerful medications that can catalyze a certain behavioral change. And I think you're right that there is a level of stigma that drives a lot of the discourse here. And also, the broader point is when you think about disproportionate impacts of visceral adiposity on populations, that not everybody can afford to eat the healthiest foods or afford to go to the gym 3 hours a day. And our failure to invest in these medications, to empower agencies like Medicaid and Medicare to fund them, is disproportionately going to carry burden on the lowest income people. And I think it's just critical that we keep hammering that in every single time.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think you had, these are just one tool. They're a powerful tool, right? But here, we have this powerful tool, and the consequences. You and I have seen this. We were all trained to take care of these diseases individually: heart failure, liver failure, right? The sleep apnea. These are all driven by this visceral adiposity.
Mm-hmm. The other side of that is also, I think there is a role, and I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about this, a role for government to play to also bring down the costs, right? And that's what I'd like our government to be doing, right? Is working with manufacturers to bring down the costs, so that when research that has been funded by the NIH comes and it's as effective as it is, that we the taxpayer don't have to pay twice. And yeah.
So just go over so everyone understands. When you say pay twice, you mean when there's federal investment in the research,
exactly,
and that money, and then when they're go pay the drug. Look, I think the government has a role even when they just pay once. I mean, we are funding the research and development for the rest of the world. I mean, I have to go back. I'm not sure how much of the GLP-1. I mean, I think it's fair to say, Dan Drucker, some of the original work was done by NIH, the basic science research on these compounds. But a lot of this was funded by the pharmaceutical industry. I think the crazy part that we have is now we have copies coming in where the API is made abroad in China, where we don't even know the source of it, right? And you have this gray market, right, of compounds where you can't assure. I mean, there is no reference standard that's available. So, I mean, how the solution is to allow these substandard compounds to come in and not. I mean, that concerns me even more. I mean, maybe the deal is, well, look, we're not going to the pharmaceutical industry, get your price down, and then we'll, clamp down on these gray market. I mean, compounding is important in certain elements, but there's a whole range of quality out there, and the government is not assuring that quality. So some people are forced to get cheaper versions that I can't assure the quality of, and that makes no sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, it's a really good point. As we wrap up here, I want to get your sense on, obviously, for all of us in public health and healthcare and science, these have been harrowing times. You testified before Congress about the impacts to HHS and FDA of these DOGE cuts. Can you give us a sense of how we should be thinking about this? We've talked quite a bit on this podcast about it, but as somebody who ran the FDA, we actually had Dr. Katelyn on previously, but I want to get your sense of what are we losing here? And then what does the pivot have to be? What should we all be doing or thinking about in this moment to try and protect what is protectable? And then how should we be thinking about the rebuild after this?
So you're asking me to make sense of something that I can't make sense of.
Yeah, we kind of try and do this all the time here.
I had the privilege, you did it at the state, the county level. I did it at the federal level. We did 676 million vaccines safely on every corner. The reason we were able to do that was because there were the institutions within government. There was the infrastructure there that was built up over decades that we were able to rely on. Yes, we had to put the pieces together, but without that infrastructure that already existed. I mean, Trump's greatest success in the first term was Operation Warp Speed. Yeah. But Warp Speed worked because those institutions, the BARDA, NIH, FDA, they existed. Now to gut those agencies, that infrastructure, they're not going to be able to do that again and come up with the next answer when there's an epidemic. I don't get that. I mean, I said this the other night publicly. Remember that night that Trump was taken by helicopter to Walter Reed?
Yep.
I mean, he was sick. He had a difficulty breathing. He had COVID, right? He could have died. I'm told that, his oxygenation was pretty low from what I hear, right? I mean, he could have died. He took 2 monoclonal antibodies. Those antibodies, he said, were miracle drugs. They were a cure. He turned around almost instantaneously with those monoclonal antibodies. I am convinced that they could have. I think they saved his life, right? Peter Stein, right, at FDA, Dr. Peter Stein ran the office that made that drug available to the president and to thousands of others. Peter Stein was fired, right, by this administration. I don't think the president even knows that they fired the person who may have saved his life. Tell me how that makes sense.
Yeah. No, when you put it that way, it's just harrowing. No, I ask you because maybe there's some thread you find that we don't find here, but you're right. I mean, this is the hard part about it, is that.
Look, the reason I wrote the book, I left Warp Speed. I think there's real ways to have enormous impact. I mean, the privilege on people's health. I mean, the reason I did diet, drugs, and dopamine was simply not to tell people what to do, but to give them the options and the information so that they can decide what to do for themselves to improve their health. I think it is one of the great, great opportunities I mean, if we can reduce this visceral adiposity, we can have as great an impact as we did with tobacco.
I really appreciate that. And we appreciate you coming on the show to share a bit more about the book and about your incredible experiences leading for the public's health. Our guest today was Dr. David Kessler. He served as the Chief Science Officer of the White House COVID-19 response team. And he is the author of the new book, Diet, Drugs, and Dopamine. Dr. Kessler, thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate you.
Great fun to be with you.
That's it for today. You can find more content at our website, incisionmedia.co. Check out our shop at store.americadissected.com for our new America Dissected merch, including logo shirts, hoodies, and mugs. And don't miss our Vaccines Matter Science Works t-shirts. If you have guest recommendations for the show, send us an email at info@incisionmedia.com. You can follow or subscribe to America Dissected on your favorite podcast platform and on YouTube at America Dissected. You can follow me on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Abdul Al-Sayed, no dash. And make sure to subscribe to Katelyn's newsletter, Your Local Epidemiologist, which breaks down the latest scientific evidence for over 300,000 followers. Search for Your Local Epidemiologist on Substack. Links to all of our sponsors are available in the show notes. I really do hope you'll check them out and show them some love. They do make the show possible every single week. Finally, on your way out, don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, drop us a like or comment, and word of mouth still goes a long way. So look, if you know somebody who'd love to have a conversation about all things health, let them know where to go. America Dissected is a product of Incision Media. Our co-host is Dr. Katelyn Jenalina. Our producer is Andy Gardner-Bernstein. Video and audio editing by Nadine Malkonia. Our theme song is by Takai Suzawa and Alex Sugiura. Sales and marketing by Joel Fowler and Nick Freeman at Big Little Media. Our executive producers are Tara Knight and me, Dr. Abdul Al-Sayed, your host. Thanks for listening. This show is for general information and entertainment purposes only. It's not intended to provide specific healthcare or medical advice and should not be construed as providing healthcare or medical advice. Please consult your own physician with any questions related to your own health.